Today, the first 3 episodes of Andor dropped on Disney Plus, and let me tell you, this is very different than what you're expecting. If you liked Rogue One, this has more of that same style and flavor, but this is also a Star Wars show that doesn't really feel like Star Wars, and that's a good thing. Now, while there are elements to it that let you know that it is set in a different galaxy, it also at the same time feels very grounded in reality, or at least as much as it can, given that it's set in space. The show was written by Tony Gilroy, who also wrote the first 3 Jason Bourne movies, and that's kind of what this feels like. It feels like a Jason Bourne movie, but set in space. This is also a much more mature take on Star Wars. It's rated TV-14, but everything about it feels much more geared towards adults. The tone, the dialogue, the themes, they're much more mature than what we typically see in Star Wars. There's even some mild profanity. There's been religious swears in Star Wars before, but someone says the S word in the show, which is something I never thought I would hear in Star Wars. And it is a bit darker, it is a bit more mature, it's a bit more complex. So it's not necessarily a family show, it's definitely geared more towards older kids and adults. This is so far what Captain America the Winter Soldier was to the MCU. This is the Star Wars equivalent of that. It's a very different type of story, and the pacing for the first 3 episodes is a bit slow, but it's a good slow. It's the type of slow that takes the time to flesh out the story and let you really soak in the characters, let you soak in the situations. Because for these first 3 episodes released, there's not a lot of action until the end of the last episode. But that's because the show is much more character-driven. It's not about the war of Star Wars, it's about the characters. And luckily, this is a 12-episode show as opposed to just 6, so that gives it more time to let you get invested. And I really enjoyed seeing a bit of Cassian's backstory. He says in Rogue One he's been fighting against the Empire since he was 6 years old, and while the actor they got to play the young Cassian doesn't look 6, he looks more around 12, you still get to see a bit of the events that drove him to fight against the Empire. And what's interesting about the show is it focuses on a main character that's not the typical hero we see in Star Wars. Cassian's a bit more selfish, he's a bit more deceptive, doesn't always use the most honest methods to get what he wants. He's not necessarily someone you'd call admirable, which makes him a bit more complex. And we've had people like that before, like Han Solo or Boba Fett, but never to this degree. He's definitely the most complex of these, anti-heroes that we've had in Star Wars so far. And so far, I do think the villains, that is my one issue with the show, is the villains could be better. They all seem pretty underwhelming. With other shows like The Mandalorian or Kenobi, you had people like Moff Gideon or Reva, people who had a lot of screen presence, who were this big threat. But with this show, there's not really an established big bad. The biggest threat so far is it's just a bunch of nameless Imperial officers. So in that regard, the villains feel kind of generic. But really, that's a small complaint. This is still a fantastic show from the world of Star Wars, and it feels like classic Star Wars, while at the same time providing a very new and refreshing flavor to it. There may not be any Jedi in the show, but the Force is definitely with it. Let me know what you guys thought of the first 3 episodes of Andor, and I will see you next week to talk about next week's episode.